Good afternoon, everybody. We made a big mistake. We should have got the auditorium. Anyway, I know you all came to listen to Shashi Tharoor and not to me, so I'll make some very brief 3 points to start the discussion, get it going. The first 2 points are two things that I share in common with Shashi, and the third point is something I wish I shared in common with Shashi. The first point, of course, is that both Shashi and I are great believers in the United Nations. I think both of us have given a significant part of our lives to the UN. I gave it as ambassador to the UN for over 10 years. You gave it as a UN public official, rising to the highest levels for over 25 years. 29 years. And that's how, frankly, how we met. Indeed, we met in Singapore when Shashi was first a UNHCR official in 1981, I think. And you can see how far he has come since then. The second thing that I share in common with Shashi is, of course, both of us are equally committed to trying to create a better global order. So he writes non-fiction books, I write non-fiction books, and we go around the world talking about that subject, and that's something we share in common. But the most important point, the third point, which I don't share in common with Shashi, which is that he's truly become a Renaissance man. Most of us have careers in some fairly defined corridors. He seems to have a career in every sphere of society. He's succeeded in the field of literature, in writing novels, and become recognized for his literary skills. He succeeded in the field of politics and was elected as a member of parliament, became Minister of State, and now, equally importantly, he seems to have, I think maybe thanks to you, Sunanda, joined a very special group of people around the world. I just heard when I was playing golf over the weekend with the Indian High Commissioner, he says, "Can you believe it? Shashi's book on foreign policy was launched by Shah Rukh Khan in Mumbai." I mean, that's a real celebrity, okay? I cannot even dream of getting a book launched by Shah Rukh Khan. But that's Shashi. He's really made it in India, in Asia, and globally. So we are really privileged to have this global rock star giving us a serious lecture on Indian foreign policy. So Shashi, over to you.
Thanks for that introduction, Kishore. It really was a pleasure being introduced by Kishore. In fact, when I first came here in 1981 as the head of the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees at the peak of the boat people crisis, I met Kishore on my first call on the foreign minister. He was then the Director General, or whatever grand title he had, handling international organizations, and I represented the international organization choice. And you should have seen Kishore in those days with his ferocious beard. He was really, I've shed my safari suit since then, and he shed his beard. But there was a time when we had this very dramatic conflict where in the waiting room or whatever, the foreign minister, Kishore said to me, as our prime minister has pointed out, "You must grow calluses on your heart or you will bleed to death." And I thought, gosh, this is a tough start to my assignment. Anyway, we've kept as close friends in the 31 years since, and I'm delighted to be here to speak under his auspices. Now, one correction. The book in Delhi was launched by the Vice President of India. We had the former Foreign Minister, Jaswant Singh of the BJP. We had our former Minister of State for External Affairs, Salman Khurshid, who was currently Minister in the Cabinet, and a couple of senior editors. It was a very sober Delhi launch. And then you quite rightly have to blame Sunanda for the Bombay launch, because Sunanda is the one who instigated the completion of the book. I was kind of dawdling over it, because as Kishore points out, I have so many other interests and stretched in so many other directions that I was writing a bit and then pausing for a few days and writing again and so on. And she sort of gave me an ultimatum saying, if you're serious about this, I want it for my birthday. And she said this in January, and her birthday was the 27th of June. So it was kind of an insane stretch for the last 3 months of writing, not sleeping very much, getting it done to give it to her on her birthday, which I'm proud to say I did. And so she organized the Bombay launch. And I can tell you that Shah Rukh Khan was her idea and her friends. I claim absolutely no credit. Absolutely no credit. But anyway, we had different launches in different parts of India. And in a sense, this is the Singapore launch. So it's great to see you all here. I'm told there are copies of the book available. So it has all the trappings of a launch right there in Singapore of Pax Indica. And having had so many pleasant memories in Singapore, and particularly those 3.5 memorable years early in my career, I'm particularly happy to be back here and to be able to inflict this book on a Singapore reading public. What's Pax Indica about? Well, first of all, I should say what it's not about, because the title is not meant to be an evocation of Pax Romana or Pax Britannica, some sort of India ruling the world kind of idea. I don't think we have either the capacity or the inclination to attempt to dominate the world, and nor has the world got room for any Indian domination. So that wasn't the idea. The title, of course, partly was to get away from any risk that the book would be seen as heavy academic going for students at the Lee Kuan Yew School. It was really meant to be a book for lay people, sort of written in the spirit of an extended newspaper op-ed, very extended because it's 450 pages, but that was the style and spirit in which the book is written. Reflections about India's place in the world in the 21st century, and written very much in the style of a newspaper columnist. And so the title was meant to be catchy in that sense, convey that we're not looking at a dry academic tome. There isn't a single footnote, there is no academic theory, there is no political science jargon. It really is like a newspaper column. But having said that, it's a book which attempts to posit a world of international networking in which India would be a linchpin. And that's what Pax Indica is supposed to suggest. My metaphor is sort of that of the World Wide Web of the 21st century, a world in which countries are connected through these networks, where in the process of that connection, they cooperate with each other in different permutations, configurations, and combinations for different purposes. And that in that way, they have sometimes overlapping and sometimes not relationships, which are a world removed from the old binary era of the Cold War, where you had to choose. And if you didn't choose, you called yourself non-aligned. Or sometimes you did choose and still called yourself non-aligned, but that's another matter. Instead, you have this kind of situation. So to illustrate it, India, for example, will have to focus both on the United Nations, where it has its own aspirations, as you know, with 193 members, and on its own neighborhood in the shape of SAARC, which is just 9 members. It has to be, and it is, a member of the non-aligned movement, which reflects its long history as a former victim of colonialism and therefore the anti-colonial history, but it's also a member of the community of democracies alongside many of the colonial powers of the imperial era. It is a member of the G77 at the United Nations, the global trade union of developing countries, but it's also a member of the global management. It's a member of the G20. And if you look at it in terms of names of countries, well, we meet every year at foreign minister level with Russia and China in a trilateral gathering known as RIC. We add the Brazilians and the South Africans to it, and we have BRICS. We take out the Russians and the Chinese, and we have IBSA, which is for South-South cooperation. And then we add the Chinese, but not the Russians, and we have BASIC for environmental negotiations. And India is in all of them, and not only because the country's name begins with that indispensable asset for any acronym, a vowel. It is also there because India has that kind of prevalent role in the world, where it has a valid, legitimate purpose to pursue its national interests through each of these configurations. What are these national interests for me? Oh, sorry, I should just finish that thought by saying I have attempted to dub this multi-alignment. It's a phrase I tossed up during my brief stint as Minister of State for External Affairs, kind of sank without trace at that time, so I've attempted to resurrect it as a writer, which is that non-alignment remains, as I said, one of the many elements of the Indian palette. But to my mind, we have to go and think beyond non-alignment to this era of multi-alignment. That's the sort of one of the central theses of the book. The other one is more at the very beginning as an assumption. I talk about our national interests first and foremost, not from the perspective of a former UN official or a former minister for that matter, or even a convinced internationalist, but rather from the point of view of a member of parliament for Thiruvananthapuram in India, where 67% of it is actually a rural constituency, despite it being the capital of the state of Kerala. And I ask myself, from the point of view of the average fisherwoman in my constituency, of whom there are several, what exactly can I realistically expect them to get out of foreign policy? And so my argument, which I lay out very early on in the book, is that our foreign policy ought to serve the interests of our domestic transformation, of overcoming our challenges of poverty and underdevelopment, of actually pushing ourselves into the 21st century by giving all our people a decent shake in life. And so from that flows things like the importance of relations with countries that are sources of investment, importance of relations with countries that are sources of trade, similarly with countries that are sources of our energy security, when we're already importing 75% of our energy needs in India, and increasingly, and this is going to become more relevant in the coming years, relations with countries which are important sources of our food security, because our demand for food is now increasingly outstripping our capacity to produce it. So all of these things become factors in working out for ourselves what we can and should get out of our foreign policy. At the same time, it's not a purely selfish, self-centered approach. I also argue that given that internationalism has been hardwired into our national DNA from the days of Jawaharlal Nehru, our first prime minister, who in his famous Tryst with Destiny speech at the moment of independence, at a time when the savagery of partition with Pakistan was ripping apart the land, people were being butchered, riots were blazing across the country, he still managed in that speech to evoke India's responsibilities to the world and spoke about how his dreams for the future are not only about India, but for the world, because he said all the countries in the world are knit together so indissolubly that we cannot pursue our interests apart. A notion that was prescient at that time and that is even more relevant today, 65 years later. So this is, broadly speaking, why I argue that India does have to play a constructive role on the global stage. I talk about the United Nations, where Kishore and I have served together. I also talk about our responsibilities for what one might call the stewardship of the global commons, where India has a capacity to make a contribution. For many years after independence, we were still amongst the rule takers in the international system, the system having been established by the victorious powers of World War II and the great powers of that day. Today, in the world of the second decade of the 21st century, we could argue that India now has the capacity to help be a rule maker as well in the international system. And I do argue that India is able, in everything from the issues you know about already, like environmental issues, refugee issues, human rights issues, and so on, peacekeeping. India's already played a role and can continue to play a significant role. But equally, I believe in the issues of the future, from outer space to cyberspace. India has a valuable contribution to make on the global agenda. So those are broadly the general themes of the book. There are also a number of very specific country chapters, because I am trying to write a book about all of India's international relationships. Inevitably a chapter on Pakistan, which I consider to be India's most significant foreign policy challenge, one on China, one on our neighborhood, one on our near abroad, which embraces Southeast Asia on this side and West Asia or the Arab world on the other side. A much less detailed chapter on what I call familiar lands and uncharted territories, that is Europe, Latin America, and Africa, and of course a chapter on the United States. In addition to which I have a chapter on soft power, which is something I've been talking about and writing about for more than a decade now in the Indian context, following in the footsteps of Kishore's and my good friend Joseph Nye. And with his blessing, I tried out my views on Indian soft power on him, and he seemed to approve wholeheartedly. I have also written in a sort of mild genuflection towards the policy wonks reading the book, about some thoughts towards the evolution of an Indian grand strategy in the world. So it's a fairly copious book. There's as a result, inevitably, fairly brief treatment of issues. One reviewer or the other said, why has he only got 3 pages on Iran? Or why doesn't he have enough about Europe or whatever? Well, ultimately, there's simply not enough space to devote full attention to everything, and I'm not trying to write a textbook, but I have tried to cover the broad sweep of Indian policy. Now, Kishore, we have 2 choices. Either I go into some detail on the specific countries, or we leave them to the Q&A period. Yeah? Why don't we just have an exchange with each other? I want to end with one thing I omitted in summarizing the book. I do have a chapter on the way in which the domestic underpinnings of our policy are structured. That has turned out inevitably to be the only really controversial chapter in the Indian press. It is a chapter principally about our Ministry of External Affairs. I do have a line which I notice is already on the posters advertising this talk, which was said to me by an Indian, already then retired ambassador when I was researching my doctorate in 1977. And he told me at that time that Indian diplomacy, he said, is like the lovemaking of an elephant. It is conducted at a very high level, accompanied by much bellowing, and the results are not known for 2 years. Now, I'm pleased to say that Indian diplomacy has become much more sprightly since then, much more agile, much more effective. But I talk about the deficiencies in the ministry. In particular, my concerns are 2 or 3. The first is the woefully inadequate size of the Indian diplomatic corps. India has fewer than 900 diplomats, which compares to 1,200 for Brazil, 4,200 for China, 6,000 for Britain, and 20,000 for the United States. In fact, the United States has more professional employees in the Indian embassy in New Delhi than India has in its entire foreign service worldwide. So I'm not saying we can be like the Americans, but it is slightly embarrassing that the comparator for the Indian Foreign Service is the Singapore Foreign Service, which has 867 members as of today. And I think they still claim they have some vacancies. So given that this is a lovely, tiny island nation state of 4 million people, and we are not, to put it mildly, we really ought to be much better equipped in terms of numbers and budget. A second aspect is, of course, the recruitment policies. I'm increasingly critical of the way in which we recruit our foreign service from a one-size-fits-all examination conducted by the Union Public Service Commission, the same examination that is used to identify policemen, customs officers, district magistrates, and so on. And I just think it's silly. I think that we need an examination which, unlike the present one, would actually identify young internationalist-minded Indians who have a curiosity about the world, a talent or an aptitude for foreign languages, and know how to talk to foreigners. A criteria which, frankly, practically most of the Foreign Service officers recruited in the recent years would simply flunk. And so I think that we need to rethink this. In fact, we need to have these examinations in places like Singapore and London and Dubai as well, so that our non-resident Indians, Indian passport holders who've grown up as children of expatriate parents and who know how to deal with the world on its own terms, could apply to join the Foreign Service. They'd never get through the present exams, but they could in such a system. So I've been making a bit of a crusade of these 2 issues, and I have, since the book, actually expatiated on the theme in a number of op-eds. So that's been a bit of a shake-up. And the third thing I've suggested is that we hire some mid-career people from other places, including, God forbid, the private sector, which has also stirred up some bit of a hornet's nest. But as a member of the Parliamentary Standing Committee on External Affairs, I've got the committee to adopt that suggestion. So I have set the cat amongst the pigeons on this one. Our bureaucracy is extraordinarily self-protective and has resisted this ferociously. And every reviewer of my book who's a former Foreign Service officer has been particularly and unnecessarily nasty given the violence I want to do to their service. But the truth is that, in fact, what the suggestion is that there's no point in trying to expand the service or fill needs by hiring more people at the bottom level and training them. That'll take you 10 years to fill the gaps you need to fill today. And that's my argument for mid-career recruitment, if necessary, on 5 or 10-year contracts or renewable 5-year contracts, something like that, to get in people at mid-levels who can actually give you the expertise and make the contributions that otherwise you would not be able to. Well, I've taken much longer than I'd planned to, so again, that's broadly the summary of what the book's all about. I have left out country specifics and so on, so rather than go into that in detail, I would rather respond to your questions and concerns. Thank you very much. Thanks, Kevin.
Thank you, Shashi, and I'm glad you left lots of time for questions, because I'm sure there'll be lots of questions in the audience. But let me ask the first one. I think the timing of your book is, by the way, brilliant, And I'll say why. Because, the traditional custodians of the global order have been United States and Europe. But if you watch the opinion polls and everything else, I mean, the Europeans and Americans the people don't want to take care of the world. They want to take care of themselves now. Right now, they have so many domestic problems, they want to focus on the domestic problems. So the old established powers are tired of being custodians of the global order, so the responsibility is going to fall on the new rising powers, China and India. And on Saturday night, Ravi and I had dinner with your sort of counterpart in China, Fu Ying, the Vice Minister for Foreign Affairs. And she was saying the Chinese people really do not want to play a global role. They want to take care of China's problems. And that's true. I mean, the popular opinion in China is we have our own problems. We're not here to take care of the world. So the only other candidate left standing, obviously, is India. And fortunately, Indians are good at running the world, as you demonstrated when you were Under Secretary General of the UN. So tell us, when will India take over the global leadership?
No, in fact, I'm anxious to assure you all that India has no such aspirations. And arguably,
now we are in trouble. Nobody wants a job.
But I think what India can do is play a constructive role in influencing and enabling the creation of a system that, for lack of a better word, we could call a multipolar one, where there will be, I genuinely believe we're moving beyond the world of superpowers. I know we went from the binary Cold War world to a unipolar world, the moment in which the US for about 20 years seemed to be the sole superpower. And there are some who see China's rise as inevitably returning us to the era of the Cold War standoff between two superpowers. I actually disagree profoundly with that. Partly or principally because, in any case, the interpenetration between the US and China is of a totally different order from the complete estrangement and hostility with which the US and the Soviet Union conducted their relations in the 50s and 60s. So the result is that here you have the Chinese owning whatever it was, $3 billion of American treasury bonds, and more than that, no, I've forgotten the exact number. Who knows the number?
3
trillion.
Billion is nothing.
Nothing these days, you're right. Yes, it dates me immediately. And the $3 trillion American treasury bonds, and the Americans, of course, so highly invested in the Chinese economy that a significant portion of Chinese manufacturers are financed by American investment capital. And given all of that, I just don't see the two of them getting into a kind of Cold War. And it's not even a valid term to use given the mutuality of their relationships. So first of all, I don't think we're going to get into a two superpower world, but also I do not see, despite some of the alarmism one reads about China's acquisition of naval and aircraft capacity and so on, I do not see China being the kind of globe-straddling superpower that we were used to in the 50s, with a capacity to change a government half a world away, for example, to come in and orchestrate a coup in Guatemala or whatever, the way in which the US was able to for its time as a superpower. And I think the US's capacity to do that is declining with every passing year. So I genuinely believe that the world-straddling, planetary-straddling superpowers we knew are a 20th century phenomenon. We won't see them in the 21st century. We will see other great powers rising with greater or lesser degrees of greatness. And India will, I think, be one of them. Now, their influence may be essentially confined to their own backyard in terms of geopolitics and to the global arena, as I described, in terms of international institutions. And if India can play a constructive role there and can, for example, through the G20, through the Bretton Woods institutions, through the United Nations itself and the Security Council, manage to provide a certain guidance, a certain point of view, I believe it will have served the purpose that the world wants in a world without one dominant leader.
Okay, questions. Now, please, if you don't mind, briefly identify yourselves and then short, sharp questions. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Let's start at the back, please. Go ahead. Yes.
You mentioned the stewardship of the global commons, and there's a lot of different definitions of global commons. So I'm curious to know what you mean by that, and what is India's role to play in that? And I guess and I also have a second question, which is, I'd like to know, what is the alternative discourse to the pernicious framework of foreign policy that's been followed for the last 200-300 years? What is the alternative that India is going to take, or that you propose India to take, outside of that the neo-colonial framework?
Jose, you want to introduce yourself to Shashi? So.
Jose Ramos. I'm teaching here for a few months.
Okay. Well, global commons. I mean, basically, when I was at the United Nations with Kofi Annan, we used to say that the world is full of problems without passports. That is, problems that cross all frontiers uninvited. Problems that, by definition, no one country or one group of countries, however rich and powerful they might be, are capable of solving by themselves. Every one of those were problems that affected the global commons. So it's problems of the environment, problems of human rights, refugee movements, international peacekeeping issues, drug trafficking and drug abuse, human trafficking, child trafficking, all of these kinds of problems that straddle international frontiers. The environment is a classic example. No one can fence off their climate. Therefore, it's a globe-straddling problem, and it's one where everybody needs to see common interests and common solutions. So all of those, any problem which by definition cannot be dealt with or solved by one country alone or an alliance like NATO alone, is a problem for the global problem of and for the global commons. So if we accept that the mechanism for resolving this is the international institutional system with the United Nations at its apex, then I'm suggesting that India would play a very important role in the attempts made through the United Nations institutional framework to draw up rules of the road for the global commons, whether it's environmental conferences, whether it's conferences on human trafficking, whether it's now, as I said, in the 21st century, new discussions on the management of cyberspace, whether it's new discussions on outer space issues. India is a world leader in rocket and satellite technology. All of these things, India can and will, I believe, play a constructive role alongside others. The whole point about stewardship of the global commons is that we will not entrust that to any one country or any pair of superpowers. We will do this collectively. Some may have more of a contribution to make by way of their size, their resources, their expertise, or a combination of all three. India, I believe, will offer all three. Alternative discourse to 300 years of foreign policy. My gosh, I think it's too much to come up with an alternative discourse in a short answer to a question. If by the last 300
years... a brilliant
years,
one-line response.
I'd save that for Twitter, actually.
Watch it. Okay, turn on his tweet after this.
But if by the current discourse of the last 300 years of discourse, you mean a state-centered, national interest pursuing world of foreign policy where countries see themselves in classic opposition to each other in pursuit of interests that inevitably clash with the interest perception of others, if that is the narrative, I think we already are moving away from that narrative with the creation of institutions like the United Nations, and that in the 21st century we go much more in that direction. That increasingly the notion of a world war now seems so far-fetched and so unthinkable. And as I said, for the reasons, and I described the US-Chinese relationship, I just think that the protagonist for a future world war will no longer be there. And so for us now, we have to think of a more cooperative world. And foreign policy will be about pursuing one's interests in cooperation with others to the greatest extent possible. So that might be the alternative narrative to suggest. Can't do that in 140 characters.
2, 3, 4, 5. Okay, 6. Go ahead, please. Yeah.
So I'm Gautam Vahi. I'm incidentally a customs officer who's passed the UPSC exam you were talking about. So I'm here.
Are you applying for the foreign service after LKY?
Right, but obviously you know how it's impossible to really break into those silos. But at the moment I'm doing MPA from here in public policy in this place. The question is that the recent narrative in the world press has seen a dehyphenation of India with China in a sense that reflect the changed realities of how China has moved forward, and it's kind of leaving India much behind in terms of its quest for development, and if I may use the term superpowerdom in a certain sense. Would it be right to say then that it's a democratic cost that we have to pay as a nation, and which will come in the way of our holding bigger,
Sorry, what is the democratic price we'd have to pay?
In terms of not being able to move fast enough and, impose...
China can move faster than India,
Yeah, so maybe to alleviate...
you want to get rid of your democracy?
To alleviate poverty and development and all of that stuff. So.
Yeah, Singapore also has moved faster than India.
Foreign service as big as yours.
There is this, lovely Indian expression you've undoubtedly heard, we are like this only. So the truth is that...
And we will never change.
No, I think some change is necessary, but some changes are impossible to conceive. And when India briefly suspended democracy under Indira Gandhi's state of emergency, it was unsustainable. She had to call a free election, which she lost comprehensively 22 months later. And one of the things that you find about India, the example of China that you mentioned is the obvious one, because when they went from 0 kilometers of 6-lane expressways to 66,000. Now it's 100,000, but a few years ago. I mean, they were basically drawing a line on a map and bulldozing anything in the path. In India, to widen a 2-lane highway, I mean, you would be stuck with the fellows on either side refusing to sell their land, or rejecting the compensation offer is not enough, going to court, political parties leaping in and conducting agitations and dharnas. Sunanda's friends from Bollywood descending and sitting on hunger strike. I mean, this is our country, and so it would take you a dozen years to widen a 2-lane road, whereas within 6 or 7 years, China went from 0 to 66,000. Now they're at about 100,000, and they're predicting 150,000 by 2020. So, I mean, those are examples, and the contrast between the Three Gorges Dam and the Narmada Dam is another one that I mentioned in the book. I think I mentioned it in the book. I mentioned it somewhere anyway. The fact is that we do have these different. But I mean, one could argue that while you might see it as a price we pay for our democracy, one could also argue that it's a very good way of bringing people along with it. Eventually, people have either been persuaded or bought over or simply exhausted into submission. At the end of the process, it works and everyone comes along with it. Whereas, as you know, I mean, China now, they're already having some pretty miserable second thoughts about the Three Gorges Dam and the environmental consequences thereof, which they didn't consider when they raced it at breakneck speed to conclude it. And the other thing in China is when you go at breakneck speed, you break a few necks in the process, which in a democracy you can't do. So that option is also not available to us in our country. I would say that in foreign policy, one of the areas where we do suffer from our system, and I think it's got nothing to do with democracy, it's got much more to do with inefficiency, is that we are not able to decide upon international commitments as rapidly as the Chinese, and we're not able to fulfill them as rapidly as the Chinese. I mean, one of the things is all the Indian breastbeating about the Chinese having developed the Hambantota port in Sri Lanka. Well, it's often not reported that it was offered to India first. And India couldn't get its act together, finally said, no, we won't do it. And then the Chinese were offered next, and they took it over, and the port's already up and functioning within a couple of years. And this is sort of the difference we have. Now, that can sometimes, oddly enough, work in our favor. If you look at the alleged India-China competition in Africa, and I don't see it as a race at all. They're two different countries with two different systems, two different approaches in Africa. You find that the Indian approach has actually worked much better. Because China comes in with a huge governmental footprint. When they do projects, they bring in everyone from the manager to the fellows laying the asphalt on the road to the last chap turning the key into the plant. Everybody comes from China. They live in their own private or ghetto-like arrangements, if you want. They don't mix, they don't train African employees and managers. They do their thing, they deliver it fast, on time, sometimes ahead of time, and they often do it on the basis of a grant rather than as a loan, and they go away. When India comes in, however, it's usually a loan rather than a grant, but at some ridiculously concessional rates of interest like 0.25% and so on. It's a massive engagement with the local government. They ask the government to decide what to do, how to do it. There's no direction being given. There's absolutely no bullying from the Indian side. They hire large numbers of African labor and African managers. They train and leave behind a newly equipped managerial capacity in Africa. They live in the community. The Indians do come and mix with the locals. And the other aspect of all of this is that not only does India leave behind, by and large, a more positive feeling, but I've spoken to a large number of African heads of state and government as well as foreign ministers. And I get the sense that while they look at China, or for that matter, the West, they look with awe and admiration, but not with any sense of familiarity. Whereas they look at India as a country that really is very much like them, that has the kinds of problems and challenges they see around themselves in Africa, that has somehow managed to overcome them, or many of them, and in ways that seem accessible to the Africans who feel, yeah, if India can do this, maybe we can do it too, you know. And in this way, they've become actually very, very pro-Indian, of course, in ways that are reinforced by Bollywood movies in every African town and so on. But the fact is that this is part of the Indian approach that I think in some ways sits better with our democracy. So not everything about our democracy or our inefficiency or our slowness is a negative.
Please.
Sir, I'm Tejas Motwani. I am doing my Masters of Law here at the law school.
Yeah, I saw you on Twitter on your way here.
Yes, sir. Sir, in your book you mentioned about Kashmir and you also mentioned about 2611, about Pakistan. You say that stronger economic ties will be helpful with Pakistan and Kashmir should be dealt separately. I would be glad if you could expand on that, on how keeping these two things separate will be beneficial for India.
Right. Well, first of all, because on Kashmir there is no conceivable meeting of the minds. We have an analogous situation with China on the border issue, which we have both sides have dealt with by putting it on the back burner, occasional irresponsible statement on either side, but for the most part, there has been not a shot fired in anger across the border since 1976. And we have gone from practically no trade in the early 90s. We've increased our trade by 230 times to $74 billion in the current fiscal year with China by simply ignoring the fact that we have this huge unresolved border problem, which ideally we want to solve, but the Chinese seem to be in no hurry to settle, and so we're just letting it sit there. I think given 65 years of inability to find any common ground on Kashmir, that to make it the centerpiece of our relationship is to condemn us to another 65 years of unproductive hostility. In any case, I argue at some length in the book that I don't believe that Kashmir is the central issue between India and Pakistan. I think the fundamental problem with India and Pakistan is that, to paraphrase Voltaire on Prussia, that in India the state has an army, in Pakistan the army has a state. And the army has ruled the state for a majority of its years of existence. When it hasn't ruled it directly, it has ruled it indirectly by making it very clear that whichever civilian government of the day was in power was given very clear marching orders and told what it could and could not do, very clear red lines that it could not cross. That in fact it did get into a position in which, frankly, every single civilian government in the history of Pakistan was unable to finish its term of office because of a decisive intervention before its official life. And even more troubling is that you join the army in Pakistan not to defend the country, but to run the country. You not just run it this way, through controlling the government, but also through, as Shashi Tharoor has described in her excellent book, by control of everything from export, import, to real estate transactions, petrol pumps, universities and think tanks. Everything's in the hands of generals and retired generals. And so the result is that Pakistan has, or the Pakistani military has, the largest share of GDP and of governmental budget of any military in the world. And how do you justify that? The only way you can continue this otherwise unjustifiable and disproportionate dominance of your own society is by having imaginary enemies on either side. And you create these enemies principally for the domestic purpose of promoting your own dominance. And that's why I believe that, yes, Kashmir is the ostensible casus belli, but if Kashmir was suddenly magically solved tomorrow, the military would have to find something else in Afghanistan or in Gujarat or somewhere in order to justify its continued dominance. Otherwise, the Pakistani public would well rise and say, why are we spending all this money on you guys? So that is, to my mind, still the central problem. Now, why do I make this realistic argument for peace and for trade? First of all, I believe it's in India's interest, that I think actually we need peace with Pakistan because our focus on our growth and our development, our domestic transformation, as I said, cannot be pursued meaningfully if we are facing implacable hostility across the border, if there is at any moment the threat of eruption of war. Investors don't like to come into war zones. So trade is an extremely necessary antidote to that. Secondly, the argument for trade is also that trade creates a constituency for peace on the other side. See, 26/11 happened in India, and India suspended all relations with Pakistan de facto because of the horrors that were inflicted on Mumbai by these terrorists trained, equipped, financed, and directed from Pakistan. Nobody in Pakistan lost anything. They had nothing to lose. Whereas if the Pakistani commercial establishment, the elites in that country, are making money hand over fist by selling to the Indian market and trading with India, they might actually be a force for discouraging military adventurism from Rawalpindi and from the ISI and those who are backing and supporting the LET, because for them, they stand to lose a great deal if trade and normal commerce with India is interrupted. So my argument for trade is also very much a sort of geopolitical argument, not just a commercial argument. I believe it's in India's interests, therefore, to create this peace constituency in Pakistan, to widen the space for a modus vivendi with Pakistan through trade.
Okay, Ifti, a mutual friend.
Our mutual friend.
What was an absolutely sparkling expose.
Thank you.
Demolish the dictum.
Can you put the microphone on so the camera can get your voice?
Yeah, especially those nice words, you should have the mic on.
Yeah, repeat the nice words for the camera.
You demolished the dictum, and very effectively so, and rightly so. That speech was given to the diplomat to conceal his thoughts. It was my privilege, by the way, my name is Iftikhar Chaudhry, ISAS, but it was also my privilege to work with Dr. Tharoor for many years in New York. And thereafter, I was the foreign minister in Bangladesh between 2007 and 9. And it was also during under our aegis, so to say, that the relationship between India and Bangladesh were put on the foundations that today make Bangladesh perhaps India's closest and friendliest neighbor. The question, Shashi, is on the role, the burgeoning role as we see it, of the Indian states in foreign policy making. We all saw how the predilections of Mamata Banerjee cleared the pitch for Dr. Singh's visit to Bangladesh and the Teesta Water Agreement, etc. So do you see the rising role of the states as an impediment to foreign policy making in New Delhi? And how do you see the Indian system resolving it so that India is seen as a single actor in the international scene rather than a composition of many diverse actors? Thank you.
It's a very good point, Ithwa, and thank you for the kind words. I must say, I've written in the book and I've spoken out against the interference by the state of West Bengal in what would have been a very reasonable agreement on the sharing of the Teesta waters with Bangladesh. And I've made the argument that we need to educate our politicians to understand that river waters are not something that's ours to give, but rather a shared resource that nature has essentially put through both countries and that need to be managed in a responsible way. And of course, I didn't say this, but it's obvious that we are also downstream ourselves from some very important waters that flow through Tibet. And if the Chinese started acting about those waters the way Mamata Banerjee is acting about the Teesta waters, we would suffer far more than what we might lose from a few cusecs going more to Bangladesh. I would argue that yes, Bangladesh is indeed one of our most important friends in the world today. It's a vital neighbor. It's a neighbor with whom we've had some rather dysfunctional relations for some time, as I have mentioned in the book. But the current government, especially having been elected with a very substantial majority, has had the confidence to do things that previous governments, including when it was in power in the past, were unwilling to do, including arresting militants and terrorists, handing them over, clamping down on the use of Bangladesh by the ISI, clamping down on the use of Bangladesh to infiltrate both terrorists and counterfeit currency made in Pakistan, which in fact comes through Nepal and Bangladesh into India. And all of these things, we're suddenly finding tremendous cooperation from Bangladesh, which we didn't have before. And we should in turn reward that cooperation, because the alternative to giving the Bangladeshi government that level of support is likely to be a backlash, an electoral backlash at the next round, which is a year away, and in which a government far more hostile to India could be elected if we don't give this government enough visible reward for what it's done for us. There are two particular things. One is the Teesta waters. The other is we have a number of enclaves going back to 47 in each other's territory, which is unnecessarily messy. It creates a lot of discomfort for the people living in those lands, because they're connected by a narrow strip of road or an embankment to the mainland of the country they belong to. So the Bangladeshi enclaves in India and Indian enclaves in Bangladesh. And a very sensible land swapping agreement was worked out. It's slightly to India's disadvantage, but as I've argued in the book, so it should be. We are the larger country, we should afford to be more magnanimous. No one could veto that, and it has been signed. But unfortunately, our constitution doesn't permit any territory belonging to India to be exchanged without parliamentary ratification in the form of a constitutional amendment. And for a constitutional amendment, you need a majority we don't have in Parliament. And the dysfunctional nature of our domestic politics in Delhi has meant that our government has not felt able to be confident enough to introduce a constitutional amendment that would attract enough opposition support. Because at a time when the main opposition party, the BJP, is attacking the government of India on everything, real, imagined, frivolous or otherwise, to present them with what could be portrayed as giving away of Indian sovereign land to a foreign country would be an invitation to disaster politically. And for this reason, this has not been done. I've given you more detail than you asked for, Ifti, but my point is you're right. If we can get all of these things right, and there are some real obstacles in the path, I believe that creating that kind of relationship with Bangladesh and similar patterns of relations with all our other subcontinental neighbors, bar Pakistan, would, I believe, give India a far more credible place on the global stage. It would be very unfortunate for India to be trying to play a global role at a time when its own neighborhood was in disarray or indeed hostile. And so I believe, and I've said so in the book, that it's extremely important for India to cultivate good relations in the neighborhood, asymmetrical relationships where we give more than we take, in order precisely to have that boost, that ballast, that security of a comfortable, happy sort of surrounding, a backyard, as it were, before we venture forth into the world.
Okay, the gentleman up there, please.
My name is Malminder from the Business Times.
Uh-huh.
I just want to ask you about India's relations with this part of the world. Ironically, as you know, leaders of ASEAN countries will be gathered in India in 3 months' time to celebrate the 20 years of commemorative relations with India and ASEAN. We seem to have seen some slowing down of relations or engagement from the part of New Delhi with this part of the world, both with ASEAN as a region as well as bilaterally. We've had the India-ASEAN Investment and Services Agreement, which has been put on the boiler for about 3 years now and it's not moved forward, as well as the review of the SICA, the second review of the SICA between Singapore and India as well. Is there a sense that India's preoccupation or the central government's preoccupation with domestic politics has sort of taken their eye off ASEAN?
No, I don't think that's accurate. In fact, first of all, I would agree with you the relationship is extremely important. The 20th anniversary would be simply a date on the calendar, but an important date because obviously it's a reminder that it's only 20 years. ASEAN was founded in 1967. And at that time, India had a very standoffish and negative attitude towards the creation of this grouping in Southeast Asia. But what you've seen since 1991 has been the serious onset of what was called a look east policy on the part of India, with a tremendous amount of attention being paid now to Southeast Asia, principally starting off with Singapore, which is the country with which we have the best relationship of all the countries of ASEAN, but also beyond that to the other ASEAN members, and beyond ASEAN to the Koreas, particularly South Korea, obviously, Japan, and increasingly China, and even Taiwan, all of which I have written about in the book. My argument is that, in fact, if anything, it's ASEAN's turn to give a little bit. India signed a free trade agreement with ASEAN despite paying a domestic cost in India. I mean, for example, I come from Kerala, but the voters are deeply incensed at the fact that Kerala palm oil products are going to be seriously undermined by ASEAN palm oil imports coming in under the FTA. But the understanding always was that ASEAN would reciprocate with a free trade agreement on services. This was a free trade agreement only on goods. ASEAN, frankly, is dragging its feet on that. So if anything, an Indian should be turning around to you guys and saying, what are you doing about reciprocating the goodwill India showed even at a political price at home by signing an FTA on goods? Why can't we see greater progress on an FTA in services? Because that is where, exporting goods to us is your strength. Exporting services to you is our strength. Let us strengthen our relationship by doing more of that. If you sense at all a lack of momentum in the relationship, it can only be in that area because India, on the goods front, everything is moving very well. And as you said, there are specific comprehensive economic cooperation agreements with some countries. Singapore is the obvious one. There's also one with South Korea. And those relationships are going very well. But when you look at services, we need much more collective ASEAN cooperation. But for example, quite under the radar, no one talks about it much. There's excellent military cooperation with individual countries in Southeast Asia. There have been exercises conducted. There have been exchanges at various levels. I would say that we're looking at a relationship that is healthy and getting healthier by the day, but where the one outstanding gap, I would place the responsibility on this side of the equation and not on ours.
Okay, we're running out of time. We're going to take two questions together. The lady here and then Kanti together in the same. Can you share the same mic? Okay, please. Yeah.
Hi.
1:30, right?
Hi,
1:30, yeah.
I'm Vaishnavi, and my question was really about the one point that you made about India's involvement from outer space to cyberspace, with a focus on cyberspace. It seems as if there's a bit of a disparity in the understanding of what the responsibilities of the private sector are in cyberspace in India, specifically with the Indian Minister for Technology demanding a lot of content supervision and content monitoring by private content providers that isn't necessarily realistic. They're asking for every site to be screened, every piece of content to be screened by the private content providers, and given the volume of content that's out there, that doesn't seem realistic. Taking that one step back, what do you think is the relationship between the private sector's operations in India, for example, in cyberspace, and the public sector's understanding of those operations and its ability to sort of enhance and enable those operations to be more successful rather than holding it back?
I think you
Can you
finger
identify
on it.
yourself for him, please, if you don't mind? Can you identify yourself too?
I'm Vaishnavi Jaikumar.
A student here or?
No, I'm about to start a stint in public policy.
Oh, okay, good for you. What does that mean, starting a stint in public policy?
I'm going to be working on public policy, on internet policy for the Asia Pacific for a tech company.
Excellent. Okay. Well, no, I mean, the short answer, frankly, is that you're absolutely right. You put your finger on exactly the problem we have. When I spoke of India's involvement at the global level, I was saying that India has the capacity, particularly the technological capacity, to help work out solutions and systems to implement whatever is agreed at the global level. But at this stage, for India's domestic situation, there is a tremendous need to educate our public sector and our bureaucracy. And it's principally the bureaucracy, and that to the bureaucracy in the Home Ministry rather than the Communications Ministry, about how exactly the internet works in the World Wide Web and social media sites and all of that. They have, I'm afraid, a long way to go. And you're quite right. We are going through a spasm in which the unfamiliarity of the cyber space as a medium of communication has created a great deal of confusion, concern, and alarm in our bureaucracy. There is, first of all, of course, the use of cyberspace for the propagation of, putting it bluntly, offensive materials. Pornography is the obvious one. There's also been some inflammatory images against certain religions and so on, which are deliberately put up by people to provoke reactions. That's created a certain amount of concern. Secondly, there's been the use of the internet and cyberspace to create panic. We've seen this very recently when there was a riot in the northeastern part of our country in which Muslims and Bodo tribals clashed. There was then a sort of counter riot in Bombay where Muslims rioted, objecting to the way in which this was not handled properly as they felt. And then suddenly there was the internet awash with threats to people of northeastern appearance everywhere in India on the basis of exaggerated and sometimes fake and distorted stories of atrocities against them in the Northeast, against Muslims in the Northeast. And this created a massive panic where literally trainloads of people started fleeing various Indian cities to go back to the Northeast, fearing they'd be attacked by Muslims. It was a very unfortunate thing, but because it was all happened through the internet and SMS, our bureaucracy was just completely caught off guard, didn't know how to deal with it, didn't know how to respond to it. And then, of course, you've got the inevitable problem in this kind of situation, that rather than policies for the internet being made by people who understand communications media, they are made by people who understand security concerns and whose principal mindset is, how do we prevent a security problem? And the result has, as you've correctly said, involved the advancement of certain prescriptions which are literally technologically impossible to apply, and which could, if pursued logically, end up with India essentially opting out of the internet, which is inconceivable, and I'm sure that inevitably these things. But this has been accompanied by a whole lot of other nonsense around. I mean, we actually had a judge in I think it was the Delhi High Court, I don't want to insult the wrong part of the judiciary, saying that we should learn from China how to handle these matters. This is in democracy. I mean, we've had all sorts of comments like this. There's a genuine sense of confusion and of people floundering about as to how to respond to this brave new world and to come up with effective policies that can cope with the kinds of challenges I've just summarized for you. So you put your finger on the problem. There is no easy solution other than a constant process of discussion, education, learning, and application. And fortunately, there are more and more processes of consultation now. We are having, for example, NGOs are rising in this field. There's a civil society organization called the Center for the Internet and Society, based in Bangalore. And they've become a significant voice in advocating sensible internet policies. There are others as well. And of course, increasingly, some of the internet companies are seeing it as in their interest to start contributing to knowledge and writing and reflection on these issues. I'm seeing a process still in its early stages in which civil society, the technological community, the international community and others will help educate the public sector, and particularly the government bureaucracy, and particularly the security bureaucracy, into understanding there are more sensible ways of dealing with all of this.
Okay, let's take 1, 2, 3. Okay, please. Yes, go ahead.
Hi, this is Rahul Mukherjee from South Asian Studies.
Hi. You quoted in the book, I believe.
In your book?
Yeah, unless there's another Rahul Mukherjee around, which is also possible, I guess.
Is that the book with Shumit that we authored?
Yes, that's a paper.
It's the same Rahul. My question is that, it's India's rise, and I'm very sympathetic to your liberal concerns, is partly, at least as much as Bollywood is, due because of its economic rise, right? Now that economic rise has a platform from which it has taken off and has a momentum which sustains it. But that economic rise has led to contradictions and confusion and deadlocks. While I do not think that those deadlocks will stop the economy from growing, but it clearly will not enable India to achieve its potential. So what is the, how do you think is this contradiction going to be resolved? Because it has serious implications for India's foreign policy.
You mean the current
The domestic
deadlock?
economic, yeah.
The current deadlock, you mean, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a very fair point, because obviously part of India's dramatic increase in global stature and attention in the last 20 years has been due to its economic success. And we were having the most amazing spectacle of every world leader flocking to Delhi, wanting to visit, wanting to be seen and photographed in India. I mean, for a couple of years, the logjam for our poor chaps in protocol had to be seen to be believed. We actually had a waiting list of heads of state wanting to come to India. It's fair to assume, I'm not in government anymore, so I don't know, but it's fair to assume that waiting list has thinned out somewhat in recent months and years, as we have begun a process of economic slowdown, as well as accompanied talk about dysfunctional policy making and economic paralysis and all of this stuff, which obviously doesn't help enhance India's appeal to the rest of the world. So I share your diagnosis. But I don't share the implicit gloom there, because I think that these are all problems that we are capable of overcoming. Some things we're not very capable of overcoming, and those relate to the fundamental flaws of the parliamentary system we so unwisely took on from the British, which have condemned us now to a series of coalition governments, and for the indefinite future, that's all we're going to have, where the politics of process is always going to be more important than the politics of performance, because staying in power requires cooperating with and succumbing to the demands of the lowest common denominator. That we're not going to be able to get away from very easily. But other things that are within the capacity of the government of the day, the finance minister of the day, the prime minister of the day, to do in terms of economic reforms, policy changes, and so on, and things that we could avoid doing, such as some of the ways in which we shot ourselves in the foot in the last budget of this year. Those are the kinds of things we can definitely get right, once again. And I do believe that that things are getting to be in hand. The Prime Minister has taken charge. The new finance minister is also an old finance minister, Chidambaram. He's part of those who are deemed to be architects of India's economic success. He knows what it will take to get things back on track. And I'm reasonably optimistic that within a short while, you'll find a lot of positive signals coming out from the governmental machinery that will reverse the story of either paralysis or decline. And therefore, that worry should, I hope, be overcome before too long. Of course, if I'm back here a year from now still saying that, then you can challenge me.
So it's time to buy Indian stocks now.
I think so.
Gentleman up there, then in front here, please. Go ahead. You just find a mic, yes.
And we must hear from Kanti as well. He's sort of...
Yeah, okay, after if you allow Kanti to come in with a question. Kanti, you must give a devastating response after this. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Varinya. I'm not associated with the LKY schools, but I am a worried citizen of India.
Okay, so am I.
Mr. Lee Kuan, you once mentioned that India is just an idea that came into being because they developed the rail networks in India. And given the diverse nature of our country, it's very hard to manage a country like that. So my question is, given the problems that we have today in terms of coalition dharma and stuff, do you think that the elephant lovemaking diplomacy should change some way to, get the country forward in the future, in the 21st and maybe the 22nd century as well?
But yes, but why would you say that it's the diplomacy that is going to change the country? The country has to be changed by domestic policies in which diplomacy serves the interests of promoting those domestic policies, but we need a strong domestic focus to knit ourselves together and work forward. And that, I think, is being done, not well enough, and certainly in our present era in which the rise of regional forces and particularist forces is so great. I would frankly worry that the way things are going, for example, that a next election could well create a situation where neither of the principal parties has enough seats to be able to constitute a government, and that you might end up with a return to the disastrous experiments of the mid-90s in which a number of state parties without a national vision tried to cobble together a central government, and those collapsed under the weight of their own contradictions twice over. So I just don't know how this is going to be, but one interesting thing is that the idea of India as a united nation or a united country of many multiple cultures has actually significantly gained ground, even while there is greater consciousness of different political identities. Some of the phenomena that have geared them, that have powered this paradox, include television. You've got, for example, the fact that now entertainment reaches the entire country, and cinema reaches the entire country. Cable TV gives you so many options in so many languages, however, that it is also possible to live in a part of India and only watch news broadcasts in your own language and not be plugged in at all into the national conversation. So some of these paradoxes are somewhat troubling, but there has been absolutely no sense at any stage of anyone saying that the experiment of pulling this country together ought to be reversed and that there should be anything like a breakup. No, there is a very much a sense of this common space, this common identity within which these regional identities are being pursued. We'll have to see how it all evolves.
Please, yes.
Thank you, Kishore Bhavani. My apologies, but I'm repeating for the camera what was missed out by what Dr. Chowdhury said. It was indeed my loss to have missed out on your sparkling presentation. I have had dealings with Africa for 40 plus years, and it's by way of a comment and a question to you. The comment.
Are you from here, sir, or from India, or?
Well, I am from here since the last few years, but basically from India, and before that, our company was founded in Tanzania in 1908.
Okay.
The comment is about China's and India's differing roles of development in Africa. What I understand from the business leaders is now there is a difference in the way the Chinese are behaving. They are not doing exactly what they were accused of in the past. They are participating, they are employing more locals, and we have an issue to answer on that. The question to you, sir, is when you said that we have to be magnanimous, a suggestion which I made to, for example, the Indian High Commission here and to Dr. Raghavan is that one doesn't lose a lot by perhaps declaring a tariff-free entry of African goods into India. The loss to the exchequer will be next to nothing, and it will grab headlines of a kind that will be amazing.
So on that particular point, we have actually announced tariff-free imports for the least developed countries. And 34 of the 50 least developed countries in the world are African countries. So most African countries that are poor are already benefiting from that provision. There will only be a handful of African countries, I'm afraid Tanzania and Kenya are probably amongst them, that don't qualify as LDCs and therefore would not get the tariff-free imports. But I'm sure we could look into how we can embrace the others into this approach as well.
Kanti.
Okay, so I'll argue against it.
Yeah,
you have to feel obliged.
We must have one argumentative Indian in the room.
I thought, Kishore, you took care of that all by yourself.
You know, the blurb here says India is sort of stepping forward in a sprightly kind of way in terms of its diplomacy, and you portray India as being potentially very constructive and an important partner on the global commons issues, and you recommend that we be omni-aligned or multi-aligned rather than non-aligned. I mean, all that presupposes lots of strengths at home, but in fact, as you suggested yourself today, if anything, probably that moment has passed. Most of the indicators show India going the wrong way, going south on pretty much everything. So on human development, India has readings that are lower than sub-Saharan Africa. Africa last year grew at an average of 6.5%, sub-Saharan Africa included. India grew at less than 6% and is going south, perhaps even as low as 4.5% next year if things don't smarten up. Things like human development. Bangladesh and Pakistan do better on a significant number of indicators of human development that India does. Inequality, I mean, India's inequalities have increased during the reform period. They haven't decreased. In terms of soft power, which you make a case for, but actually if you look around in this region, I've been here 20 months, take the case of Indian democracy, I haven't heard a single admiring word about India's democracy. I mean,
you may just be in the wrong country for that.
In the region, I don't think you'll hear, and it's, I mean, you said yourself, the parliamentary system is almost at a point of collapse. In terms of the economic growth rate, we've already heard, and Rahul pointed out, is a shambles at the moment, frankly. So the foreign service and bureaucratic capacity, the problems of internal coherence politically. So in fact, all the markers seem to point the other way, which is that India should draw in its horns, pull the blanket over its head, to mix metaphors, and pursue a very modest, very quiet, very local, and perhaps essentially just an economic diplomacy and nothing else, because it just doesn't have the capacity to project power and influence and weight at all. And a moment of 10 years ago is gone. In fact, we're going the other way.
Well, you did get an argumentative Indian?
I did get an argumentative. Well, as I've been saying for about 20 years, in fact, and wrote in one of my earlier books, anything I can tell you about India, the opposite is also true. So I don't disagree with anything Kanti said, except that there are equally valid points on the other side of the ledger, and that's been part of the challenge of understanding India and coming to grips with it, is that you can look at the same sets of data and see enough to justify the sort of doom and gloom that Kanti has expressed, as well as some of the guarded optimism that I have expressed. I mean, after all, basically a pessimist says everything is bound to go wrong, as he said, go south. The optimist says, look, things just might go right, I mean, you look at the future with uncertainty, you're an optimist. That's my definition. So I would say that yes, we have serious challenges, and those domestic challenges are precisely what, in my view, argue for a more assertive foreign policy and a more effective foreign policy. Because if indeed we're doing badly on the Human Development Index, we need to be able to bring in more investment to generate more jobs and generate more opportunities. If we are actually not providing enough electricity to our darkest villages, we need to have a better energy capacity. In other words, we need to use our foreign policy more and more to address the very deficiencies that you pointed out. So this would call not for putting our head under that proverbial blanket, but for getting out there and actually helping fulfill these problems that we have in our country. The problems are real, and I'm not one of those who unrealistically sort of talk about everything going sunnily well in India. But I would argue that we have the need as well as the capacity to be more assertive and more effective in our foreign policy, with a view to ensuring that a few years down the road you can't say all the things you just said here today.
Put the microphone on.
That's not a shaping foreign policy. I mean, it's a coping, damage limitation foreign policy, which is what I mean by pull the blanket over your head. And I'm not saying disappear from the world, but I'm saying that we fundamentally don't have the capacity to shape things in the way that you suggest.
But that's it, Kanti. See, I feel this is exactly what we're doing so far, is doing more coping than shaping. This book is an exhortation to see our own potential and do more in our own domestic interests. So yes, I mean, I don't disagree with you at all. In fact, many would argue that our conduct on the Security Council during our 2 years there suggests a very defensive mindset and approach rather than one that's confident and assertive. And I would argue that we definitely have the capacity to do much more if only we realized our own strengths and our own abilities. So mine is a description of capacity and potential as much as it is of existing ongoing situation, of circumstances.
I'm afraid at this stage I have to apologize to all the many hands I saw. We have reached the hour 1:30. The next part of the program is extremely important. You all have to buy the books and get his signature. I want to save some time for that, but I want to make one last important point. When I travel overseas as dean, I often meet the alumni of the Lee Kuan Yew School and I ask them, what is it you appreciated best about the Lee Kuan Yew School? Well, the fellow students, the faculty, the environment. But they inevitably say that the public talks, public lectures at the Lee Kuan Yew School are absolutely amazing. And I'm glad, Shashi, you kept up that track record of having amazing public lectures at the Lee Kuan Yew School. I'm sure all the students here will remember this for many years to come. And I'm sure you've also proven to them that public policy can be people think public policy is very dull. Actually, you can be substantive and be sexy at the same time. So Shashi, thank you very much.
The Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy.